Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we are going to be taking a deep dive into something that I think is really foundational to making any kind of real progress in life.
Yeah.
And that is the power of small habits.
It's interesting, yeah, right? Like we tend to focus on, making these huge leaps and wanting these dramatic transformations.
Yeah.
But when you actually kind of break it down and look at how people really make lasting change, it's almost always the result of these really tiny everyday actions that kind of build up over time.
Yeah, and those big goals, I think, can often feel so daunting, like so far off, that it's easy to just kind of get discouraged before you even start.
Absolutely.
So this deep dive is kind of designed to sort of flip that on its head and really explore how those little daily efforts can lead to really substantial improvements in your life.
Right.
So our kind of mission here is to really try to understand the mechanics behind it. Like, how do these small habits actually work?
Right.
And crucially, how can you use that knowledge to reach your goals?
Yeah.
Whatever those goals may be. Right. So we've got some fascinating material here that digs into the science and really brings this concept to life with some really compelling real world examples.
Yeah, so let's unpack this idea of the surprising power of tiny gains.
Yeah, okay.
It might sound a little simplistic at first glance.
Yeah.
But when you really consider those long-term effects, it's actually quite remarkable.
Right.
So think about it this way. The concept of compounding.
Okay. Yeah, like a snowball rolling downhill.
Precisely.
It starts small, but as it goes, it just gets bigger and bigger.
Exactly. And with habits,
Yeah.
it's your time and effort that you're consistently investing.
Yeah.
A 1% improvement each day might seem completely insignificant in the moment.
Right.
You probably wouldn't even notice it.
Yeah.
But over the course of weeks, months, years,
Yeah.
those tiny percentages, they accumulate exponentially.
Yeah, it's that exponential growth, isn't it? That's what really gets you.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we looked at kind of brings this home with a really simple but powerful example.
Yeah.
And we're talking about reading just 10 pages a day.
10 pages.
Doesn't seem like a lot.
No.
Right.
Not at all. Something you could easily fit in.
Yeah, like it's not going to disrupt your whole schedule to read 10 pages.
Right.
But when you actually do the math, that seemingly small habit of reading 10 pages a day translates to finishing over 12 books a year.
That's a lot of books.
Which is a lot of books.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of knowledge, new perspectives, insights gained from what feels like a pretty minimal daily effort.
Right.
So it really kind of makes that compound effect tangible, doesn't it?
It does. And it's not even just about, the sheer number of books. It's about, that gradual expansion of your understanding.
Yeah.
The development of new mental frameworks.
Yeah.
The cumulative impact on your ability to, think critically and creatively.
Absolutely.
All of that comes from just that consistent small habit.
So this isn't just some kind of abstract idea we're throwing around.
No.
There's real world evidence showing that this principle works in practice.
Right.
And that brings us to our next point, evidence in action.
Yeah.
We've got some compelling stories here that illustrate how this focus on small habits has led to some pretty extraordinary results.
Right. These examples demonstrate that this principle isn't just limited to, one specific area.
Yeah.
It applies across a wide range of endeavors from, achieving peak athletic performance to building long-term financial security.
Exactly.
So let's start with the story of the British cycling team, which was highlighted in James Clear's book, Atomic Habits.
Okay, yeah.
Which was one of our key sources for this deep dive.
So this is a story I found particularly striking.
Yeah.
They, for years, they were, to put it mildly, not a major force in international cycling.
Right.
They hadn't really had any significant wins to their name.
They were consistently underperforming on the global stage.
Yeah, for sure.
And then a new coach comes in.
Okay.
With completely different philosophy.
Okay.
And instead of focusing on these massive overhauls or trying to completely reinvent the wheel,
right,
he emphasized this concept of the aggregation of marginal gains.
Okay.
So making tiny 1% improvements.
1%.
In literally every single aspect of their operation.
Wow.
And it wasn't just, the obvious things like their bikes or their training regimens.
Yeah.
They looked at incredibly granular details.
Okay.
The aerodynamics of their clothing.
Wow.
The mattresses their athletes slept on to optimize recovery.
Oh, wow.
even the most effective way for the team to wash their hands to minimize the spread of illness.
I mean, that's getting down into the weeds, really thinking about every little thing.
And what's fascinating here is that any single one of those 1% improvements seems almost too small to matter on its own.
Right.
But when you accumulate, dozens, even hundreds of these tiny optimizations across every facet of the team's performance, the combined effect is transformative.
Right.
They went from being relative unknowns to absolutely dominating Olympic cycling.
Yeah, they were winning gold medals left and right.
Huge number of gold medals in a relatively short period of time.
It's really remarkable.
It really is.
And I think for you listening, it's a really powerful illustration of how these small, seemingly insignificant tweaks, when they're applied consistently and strategically across the board, it can lead to really breakthrough results even in these highly competitive fields.
Absolutely.
So it makes you wonder where you might be able to identify, those hidden 1% opportunities in your own life. That can make a real difference.
Right.
And the research also pointed to another really compelling example, this time from the world of finance.
Okay.
Warren Buffett.
Yeah. Classic example.
I mean, now his path to immense wealth. It wasn't through some overnight sensation or risky gamble.
No.
Right? It's been a decades-long process of making consistently smart, relatively small investments and allowing the power of compound interest to work its magic.
Exactly. It's that long game.
Yeah.
It's the consistency over time.
Right. Buffett's success isn't about hitting a few home runs.
No.
It's about a long series of singles and doubles executed with discipline and consistency over many years.
Exactly. And this raises an interesting point, I think, for you to consider.
Yeah.
How can you apply this same principle of, consistent, small, smart actions to your own financial goals?
Right.
Maybe it's automating a small weekly investment or, diligently learning about personal finance for 15 minutes a day.
Yeah.
The key is that steady, consistent effort over time.
I love that.
Yeah.
Small, consistent effort over time. So whether we're talking about elite athletics or building substantial wealth, these examples really underscore, I think, the core message here.
Yeah.
That consistent, seemingly insignificant actions, when they accumulate, they lead to extraordinary achievements.
Right.
It's not about these giant leaps that we sometimes feel pressured to make.
Right.
It's about that steady, persistent effort over time.
And to really harness the power of these small habits, I think it's incredibly helpful to understand how these habits form in the first place.
Yeah, how do they actually form?
Right.
Let's get into the nuts and bolts of that.
Exactly. And that brings us to our next area of focus, decoding the habit loop.
Correct.
So this is where we kind of dive into the underlying science of habit formation.
Okay.
Drawing on these psychological principles.
Right.
And, the research we looked at really outlined this concept of the habit loop.
Okay.
So can you maybe walk us through the key components of that?
Yeah. So the habit loop is essentially this 3-part neurological cycle that governs how our habits are formed and maintained.
Right.
And it involves a cue, a routine, and a reward.
So the cue is kind of like a trigger.
Okay.
It's a signal to your brain to initiate a particular behavior.
Got it.
The routine is the habit itself.
Yeah.
Which can be, a physical action, a mental process, or even an emotional response.
Right.
And the reward is that positive reinforcement that your brain receives after completing the routine.
Okay.
Which helps it remember that pattern for the future.
Right. So it's like our brains are creating these shortcuts so we don't have to consciously think about every little thing we do throughout the day.
Exactly. It automates certain behaviors to free up our mental bandwidth for other things.
Right.
And so once this cue routine reward loop becomes established, your brain actually starts to anticipate that reward whenever that cue appears.
Interesting.
And that in turn creates a craving for the routine.
Oh.
And that craving is really what drives the habit.
So it's not just like a mindless automation. It's actually like there's a desire there.
Yeah, there's a pull.
Yeah. The research gave a really practical example of how you can kind of use this framework to build a reading habit.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really useful, if you're someone who wants to be constantly learning and growing.
Absolutely.
So the suggested cue is simply keeping a book in a visible spot, like right on your pillow.
Okay.
Makes it easily noticeable when you're winding down for the evening.
Right.
And then the routine is to read for just a short period, say 5 minutes
Okay.
before you go to sleep.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. It's not a huge commitment.
No, it's not a lot.
Doesn't feel like a burden.
Right.
And the reward in this case can kind of be twofold.
Okay.
First, there's the feeling of relaxation as you disengage from, the stresses of the day.
Right.
And immerse yourself in the book.
Yeah.
And then second, there's that intrinsic reward of knowing that you're making progress
Okay.
towards your goal of learning and expanding your knowledge.
Right.
Even if it's just a little bit each day.
It's that sense of accomplishment.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think, the reward doesn't always need to be something external or immediate.
No.
Sometimes that internal sense of accomplishment and progress is enough to really reinforce that loop.
Precisely. And understanding this habit loop is incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Because it gives you a framework.
Okay.
Not only for intentionally building beneficial habits, but also for identifying the cues and rewards that might be driving less desirable habits.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is the crucial first step in changing them.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Right.
So we understand the power of small habits.
Right.
We understand the science behind how they form.
Yeah.
Now, how do we actually go about building those good habits that we want?
Right. How do we put this into practice?
That leads us to our final segment, actionable strategies for building good habits.
All right, let's hear them.
The research we looked at provided 4 really straightforward strategies that I think anyone can start using. And these strategies are all about kind of making that process of habit formation more accessible, less intimidating, and ultimately more sustainable in the long run.
Right.
So the first key strategy is to start small.
Start small. Okay.
And this is so important because, as we talked about at the beginning, it's that feeling of being overwhelmed by a big goal that often stops us from even getting started.
Absolutely.
The idea here is to make that initial step so tiny that it feels almost effortless.
Okay.
The research gave a fantastic example.
Okay.
If you want to make exercise a habit, start by doing just 1 push-up a day.
1 push-up.
1 push-up.
Okay.
It might seem almost comical. Like, what real difference can a single push-up make?
Right.
But the point isn't about the immediate physical benefit.
Okay.
It's about establishing the routine.
Okay.
Making exercise this non-negotiable part of your day, no matter how small, you're lowering the barrier to entry.
Yeah.
So significantly that there's virtually no resistance to getting started.
So you're tricking your brain a little bit.
Yeah, kind
of.
of.
Making it think that this is easy.
Exactly. And once you've consistently done that 1 push-up for a week or 2, it becomes much easier to gradually increase that number.
Good.
You've built that foundation. You've established a habit of, getting down on the floor each day and doing something.
Yeah.
So the second strategy is to make it easy.
Make it easy.
To really design your environment in a way that supports the habit you're trying to build.
Okay. I like that.
So this is all about reducing friction and making that desired behavior the default option.
Right.
The research illustrated this with the example of wanting to eat healthier.
Okay.
So if you keep fruits, vegetables, other healthy snacks readily visible and accessible in your kitchen, you're far more likely to reach for them when hunger strikes.
Makes sense.
Right, as opposed to having to go out of your way to find, those less healthy options.
It's about setting yourself up for success.
Exactly.
Rather than relying solely on willpower.
Yes.
Which we all know is a finite resource.
Absolutely.
So if you want to read more I'll leave books in places where you tend to spend your downtime.
Right.
If you're trying to drink more water, keep a water bottle filled and within easy reach throughout the day.
Yeah, put it right there on your desk.
Exactly.
So you're constantly reminded.
Right.
The third powerful strategy is to track your progress.
Track your progress.
Okay. This gives you a tangible way to see how consistent you're being.
Yeah.
Which can be incredibly motivating.
Right.
And help you stay on track.
Yeah, because you can see that you're making progress even if it's small.
Exactly.
It feels good to check things off a list.
It does. It does.
The research suggested using a habit tracker or a simple journal.
Yeah, there are tons of great habit tracking apps available now.
Right.
Many of which are free. Or you can just use a calendar and put a check mark or an X on each day that you successfully complete the habit.
Yeah.
And that visual representation of your progress can be surprisingly rewarding.
It is.
And it really reinforces the behavior.
Right.
Plus, if you see a gap in your tracking,
it can kind of prompt you to get back on track.
Get back on the horse.
Exactly.
And it also provides valuable data, you know?
Right.
If you notice that you consistently skip your habit, on a particular day of the week
Oh, interesting.
or at a certain time,
Yeah.
you could start to investigate.
Yeah, what's going on there?
What are the underlying cues or obstacles there?
Yeah.
And adjust your strategy accordingly.
Right.
So it's not just about, blindly checking things off a list.
Yeah.
It's about using that information to refine your approach.
It's about being mindful, isn't it?
Exactly.
And then the fourth and final strategy here
Okay.
is to reward yourself.
Reward yourself.
Okay. So acknowledging and celebrating those small wins along your habit building journey
Yeah.
can provide that positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
That's so important for strengthening that habit loop.
Absolutely.
The research suggests if you successfully stick with a new habit for a week,
Okay.
treat yourself to something enjoyable.
Right.
And it doesn't need to be extravagant or expensive.
Right.
It could be something as simple as enjoying a relaxing cup of tea,
Yeah.
spending 15 minutes doing a hobby you enjoy,
Right.
or just taking a moment to acknowledge and appreciate your consistency.
Exactly. The key is that it's something that feels genuinely rewarding to you.
Yes.
And that strengthens that positive association
Yeah.
with performing the habit.
So to recap those actionable strategies,
Right.
start incredibly small.
Start small.
Make the desired habit as easy as possible to do.
Make it easy.
Actively track your progress so you can see how you're doing.
Track your progress.
And reward yourself for those small victories along the way.
Reward yourself.
These are all concrete steps that
Yeah.
you can take starting today.
Absolutely.
And as we bring this deep dive to a close, we want to pose a direct question to you. Considering everything we've discussed about the power of small habits and how to build them,
Yeah.
what is one tiny habit that you will commit to starting today?
I like that.
Really take a moment to think about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this monumental life change,
Right.
just one small, manageable action
Right.
that you can begin implementing right now.
Exactly.
Because as we've seen through the science and the real world examples,
Yeah.
it's those seemingly insignificant actions
Yeah.
performed with consistency
Right.
that ultimately possess the power to create these truly remarkable transformations in your life over time.
Absolutely.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
What if you could identify just one tiny keystone habit?
A keystone habit.
So this would be a habit that has a ripple effect
Okay.
and positively influences other areas of your life.
Interesting.
Could that trigger a cascade of beneficial changes across different domains?
Yeah.
Even those that might seem completely unrelated to that initial small habit.
Yeah. What would that be?
What might that one tiny keystone habit be for you?
That's a great question to think about.
Give that some thought.
Yeah. Take some time to reflect on that.
Thanks for joining us,
Thanks, everyone.
and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See ya.